So I wanted to create a guide and talk about tarot cards. Um, when I was a teenager, when I was an adolescent, when I was in my early 20s, I read all these mystical books, and one of the authors I really enjoyed was this writer Uspensky. And one of the things that he was interested was tarot. So that was how I was first exposed to it, was through him. And I thought it was very interesting. I loved the symbolism of it. I loved the imagery of it. Um, but it just was never my focus. It wasn't something that I ever explored in detail. Um, Later on, when I was in my mid 20s, one of my friends made a reference to them, and I decided to buy a Rider Waite deck, um, and check them out and try to do it. And I thought it was really, really interesting, and that it's actually a really great practice you can do, just for reflection and contemplation, and as a personal spiritual practice. Um, so, a little bit about this here. So, if you do tarot, let's try to like explain it from a universal point of view. You don't have to be spiritual. You don't have to believe in divination to do tarot, and that's sort of what's great about it. You can be completely secular and do tarot and appreciate it and enjoy it. You can believe in it as divination. You can, if you believe in destiny, you can believe it from that perspective, but you can also appreciate and enjoy tarot from a completely secular point of view. Um, the central thing here is to view it as a tool for self knowledge and introspection, as a tool to quote unquote to know thyself. Um, you can also view it as a tool for divination, excuse me. Um, but the primary focus is that it's this tool for you to reflect on life, reflect on your experiences, um, and that's one way you can use it in your life. Um, so the origins of tarot, the cards themselves are relatively modern. They do have antecedents in the playing cards of the Renaissance, but the A.E. Waite deck, the Rider Waite deck, which is the most famous one, comes from the Victorian age, and it was made by this guy, this Englishman, Waite, who was a friend of Aleister Crowley, and who was interested in mysticism and esotericism and sort of occult ideas. And one of the things he created that was part of his legacy was he made the famous tarot deck. Um, his deck is arguably the best one, and one of the reasons why this is the art that he created for it, and it was made by this woman, so Pamela Coleman Smith. And if you look at all the different tarot decks, the classic set, the Waite deck, really is some of the best ones. And what it does, it combines Christian symbolism, Jewish symbolism, Egyptian, Hellenic, Western esoteric symbolism, in a really beautiful, elegant way. And when you look at the cards, they're packed with meaning, and you can unpack so many different interpretations because of the richness of the art that they put into the cards. So, what are the antecedents of tarot? Where does it ultimately come from? You would go back to ancient Greece and you would look at the oracle. Um, if you've never heard of the oracle before, it's the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, which was this famous fortune teller, this famous religious institution that existed in ancient Greece. And this was something, it was sacred to the god Apollo, and it was something that was very sacral, something that was very respected um, in the ancient world. And it was very similar, if you've ever heard of how the Tibetans will search for the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. They had a similar process here. And the priests of Apollo, in ancient times, they would scour Greece and they would try to find young women who they felt were very intuitive and they were very skilled at divination and prophecy and mysticism, and they would select them, and then they would become the priestesses of Apollo. And then one of them would be selected, and then she would become the oracle or the pythoness of the sanctuary. And the oracle was consulted very consistently throughout ancient history. Some examples of people who consulted the oracle, one of the most famous was Socrates. And if you read the Platonic dialogues, it's actually Socrates' friend goes to the oracle and he asks her who was the wisest person in ancient Greece. And she answers Socrates. And that was a prophecy that caused Socrates to reflect and to ponder. And he really couldn't believe what she said, but it had this gravity because it was something that was proclaimed by the Oracle of Delphi. And so he went on this whole sort of life quest for wisdom and philosophy because he thought he was a fool and he was an ignorant person. But this was the beginning, basically, of Western thought and Western civilization. It comes from Socrates hearing this proclamation from the oracle. She was consulted by Alexander the Great. The tale we have that was passed down to us is she told Alexander that he was invincible, and then he did go on to be unbeaten on the ancient battlefield, and he conquered the whole Persian Empire. Another famous story of the oracle is the legendary founder of Sparta, Lycurgus, went to her and she helped him in creating the constitution that was the basis for the city-state of Sparta. Some other famous oracles of her, there's this famous story of Croesus, who was an ancient king of Lydia, and around 500 BC, he is questioning the oracle if he should go to war with Persia and with the empire of Cyrus the Great. And then she gives him the line, if you go to war with Persia, quote, a great empire will fall. And so he interprets this, in his favor, that he'll defeat Cyrus. And so this was one of the reasons that he went to war, was misinterpreting what she said. If you've ever seen the movie 300, they have a scene which is supposed to be the Spartans consulting with the Oracle of Delphi. So this is like a famous story from ancient Greece. The Persians are invading, they're going to take over Athens, they're going to take over Sparta. So the Athenians go to her, and she gives this prophecy: either the city or the people will be destroyed. And that encourages them to abandon Athens and create a huge navy and put the people on the ships. And it turns out to be true. And even though the city of Athens is destroyed by the Persians when they invade, the people are preserved, and then they go on to win this great naval victory against the Persians. And it was, a product of the consultation with this oracle. And then the Spartans, when they consult the oracle, she says, quote, either the city or the king will be torn limb from limb. And so this was what encouraged Leonidas. If you know the story of the 300 Spartans, they fight at Thermopylae and they fight to the last man, and they have this heroic sacrifice, and the king sacrifices his own life. And this was a response to the prophecy of the oracle. And then later on, the Persians never actually make it to the Peloponnese, and so they do destroy Athens, but they never actually make it down to Sparta. Another famous oracle of her, the father of Alexander the Great, Philip II. He had this prophecy. It was, quote, the bull is ready, the sacrifice is prepared. And then he interpreted this as an oracle to go to war with Persia, and it ended up turning out that he interpreted it wrong. And on the eve of his war with Persia, he thought he was going to do animal sacrifices, and instead he was murdered. He was assassinated. And so it turned out that he was the bull, he was the sacrifice. And then other things, the founding of Greek colonies, Greek cities throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, the founding of the city of Cyrenaica in Libya, for example, are products of the Greeks going and consulting with this oracle. So a recurring theme with the prophecies of the Oracle of Delphi is they're ambiguous, and you have to interpret what she says. And often you can interpret her oracles in entirely contradictory ways. And so if you appreciate this, then you can view them as an exercise in wisdom or an exercise in self-knowledge. And so this is the value of getting guidance like this, is it's a tool for you to reflect. And so this applies for the ancient Oracle of Delphi, and then this similar idea applies for the tarot cards as well. Just to give you the later history to kind of finish the story, later in antiquity, people just stopped consulting her. The institution declined. There was one last Roman emperor who was pagan and tried to revive it and tried to maintain having the oracle. But with the rise of Christianity, she basically faded into obscurity, and then she disappeared. And then later on, you got this other institution, which we're familiar with today, and instead we have the papacy. So we had this ancient, feminine, spiritual authority, and now we have this modern, masculine, spiritual authority. Okay, so getting into the tarot proper now, some general recommendations of how to do it. First is I recommend that you do it very rarely. Don't over consult, don't overly rely on it. Do it infrequently. Do it as something sort of special that you do. And that will allow you to retain the gravity and the sense of impact that you feel when you do a tarot reading for yourself or for someone else. If you draw a card, you have to accept it and then interpret what you get. Don't do do-overs. If you get a bad card and you don't like it, you have to accept it, and you have to work with what you've got. What are some of the ways you can do tarot? So the simplest way is just ask a question and then draw a card, and then try to interpret the symbols that you see on the card. Another simple way is you can write down 3 to 5 specific questions, draw the cards in the order of the answers, and then reflect on the symbols and try to interpret them. Some other methods people have, you can do past, present, and future and draw 3 cards. And then if you go into the more in-depth ones, there are all sorts of really interesting, unique spreads, and you can spend a whole afternoon drawing these and interpreting them and talking them over with a tarot reader. And you can look these up on the web for what they are and how to do them and how to interpret them. And so you have things like the Celtic cross, the horseshoe spread, the pentagram spread. You can look at different life domains, and you can draw the cards that way. So So one of the arguments about tarot cards is the idea that they are archetypes. What are archetypes? It's basically this idea from the Greek philosopher Plato, and it's the idea that the symbols of the tarot cards are symbols of this kind of universal religion. And what this means, or what this is trying to say, is that basically there are certain things that all humans inevitably experience, that they're intrinsic to the human condition. Male and female, sun and moon, light and shadow, life and death. And we all experience these things no matter who you are, where you're born, what time period that you're born into. And these universal ideas, these universal experiences are reflected in the cards. How to interpret the cards, how to interpret the symbolism. I find that having a background in literature actually really helps. So if you do, symbol analysis for, an English literature class, the same type of analysis, you can use that when you reflect on the cards. So for example, if you have a card and it's a picture of the desert, it means deprivation, it means absence, the absence of something, it means want, it means the lack of something. If you see roses, if you see grapes, they represent fertility, wealth, fecundity, prosperity, birth. The sun is a masculine symbol, so you think of the stability and the constancy of the sun, and then the moon is a feminine symbol. And then the moon is usually feminine because if you think of the cycles of the moon, it's tied to the menstrual cycle. Some basics about the cards. So they're divided between the major arcana. So these are the beautiful visual cards, and so these are the iconic ones that people instantly think of when they think of the tarot cards, so like Death or the Hangman. And the minor arcana, which are more like a traditional deck of cards, and they're divided into 4 suits. So unlike playing cards, the tarot cards have these suits instead. So you have wands, cups, swords, and pentacles. To go over some general analysis of the cards before we start looking at them individually, a big thing I notice when I look at the suits is masculine and feminine symbolism. So to me, like when I look at the wands suit, to me that's very overt masculine symbolism. Swords also, in my opinion, is very masculine. And then if you look at cups, to me that's feminine symbolism. And then so this would mean that there are 2 masculine suits and then there's 1 feminine suit. Some other just general things that we can notice here. The remaining suit is called pentacles, and the pentacle is an interesting sort of ambiguous symbol. It's kind of multiple things at the same time. One view of it is it's this medieval symbol of kingship, which is called the globus cruciger. So that was a symbol, when you're a monarch in the Middle Ages, you would hold that, and that represents, how you became, a ruler by the grace of God. But the pentacle is also, it's multiple things. They're also coins, so they represent material wealth. But then they're also these upright pentagrams, which are inscribed in them at the same time. And the pentagram represents symbolically the 4 traditional elements, so earth, air, fire, and water, and then the 5th element, which is spirit. And when a the pentacle is facing up, it represents the spirit triumphs over matter, and then when the pentagram is facing down, it represents matter triumphing over spirit, or that you're denying the spirit. So the pentacle, it represents all these things. It represents spirituality, it represents material wealth, and so it has this ambiguity when you interpret it. Okay, so having gone over this background, let's take some time and look at the symbolism of some of the individual cards. So if we start with the major arcana, one of the most interesting and unique cards is the starting card, which is the Fool. Maybe you don't want to draw the Fool, maybe you don't like the Fool, but as a symbol, the Fool represents us. It represents everyone. We're all the Fool. It's how we're all born. It's how we all enter the world. It represents innocence. It represents someone who's naive. It represents someone who lacks self-awareness. It represents new beginnings. It represents a new person entering the world, someone who doesn't know anything, who's experiencing something for the first time. But the card is also filled with this optimism, this idea of infinite possibility. If you look at the image, he's being warmed by the rays of the sun. So it's someone who believes in the divine, someone who believes in the idea of illumination, religious illumination as an idea, someone who's a philosophical idealist, which means that it's someone who believes that the spirit or the soul is real. So the Fool is the opposite of a cynic, but they're overly optimistic in terms of their view of the world, which results in him getting hurt. And so as you look at the image, what is he doing? He's doesn't have many physical possessions, he's just hurtling forward, and what is he about to do? He's about to step off a cliff. And so this is symbolically that it represents that a lack of wisdom and a lack of self-knowledge in life can injure us. When you draw this card, it can be a danger, it can be a warning, it can be a sign you're entering a situation that you're in ignorance about. It could be a sign that you need more wisdom, you need more experience, or that you're about to fall off a proverbial cliff. Another beautiful card is the Magician. And so the Magician represents the divinity of man, that man is a bridge between the sacred and the profane, between the spiritual and the physical. If you look at the image, if you look at what he has on the table, you can see that it's this kind of universal card, this kind of archetypal card, that all of the suits of the whole deck are on the table in front of him. And so it shows the power of the magician who reconciles all these things. Symbolically, he's inspired by the Magi of the ancient Eastern mystery religions, of the ancient Persian religion. The magician represents dynamism, he represents power, he represents possibility. One idea that you can derive in looking at the card is that the magician is the Fool and the Fool is the magician. And what's the difference between the two is it's the difference of self-awareness in life. It's the difference of knowledge and experience in educating the human being and making you complete, is what the difference is between the Fool who lacks knowledge and then the magician who has knowledge. Another card which is very frightening to people is the Death card. And so death represents the inevitable power, the invincible power that death has over all of us. So if you look at the image, the king, who is this secular authority who rules, the world during his whole life, is completely, brought low and is totally defeated by death. But everyone in the image is basically subordinate to death as an idea. And then the only one who can greet death, possibly, maybe, is the spiritual, right? Or is the spiritual figure or the spiritual authority. So symbolically, the Death card it doesn't have to mean death or defeat in itself. It can just mean change, it can mean loss. There are many ways that you can interpret the cards, and it doesn't have to always be in the most fatalistic way. Another beautiful card, one of my favorites, or my favorite personally, is this one. It's called the Hangman. It's probably the most mystical card in the whole tarot deck. It's also, like death, very frightening to a lot of people. And symbolically, if you think of the spiritual life, if you think of the inner life, how the individual grows in their personal relationship with the divine, symbolically it represents the dark night of the soul. It also represents the mystery, of Christ being crucified, dying, and then the resurrection. It also recalls, if you think of the cross, in the card, or on the card itself, it's also recalling Norse mythology. It's also recalling how Odin was crucified as well. It's ultimately a positive symbol, and it's suggesting that the Christian narrative, that you can overcome death, that you can conquer death, that there's redemption for suffering, it's suggesting that narrative, that myth in Christianity is true. And the idea that if you live a life, or if you follow a path of suffering, mortification, and hardship, that ultimately there is redemption in the end. So this card, the Devil, you can see the influence of Eliphas Levi on the card, and it uses his image that he made of the devil in the picture that they create. And then they also incorporate the idea of the upside down pentagram. So we said the matter triumphing over spirit, is another symbol that's a part of this card. So if you draw the devil, it's kind of a dark version or a shadow version of the Lover's card. And if you've ever heard this quote, like the idea that marriage is freedom and bondage, the Lovers represents the positive aspect of marriage, and then the devil is sort of like the negative aspect of marriage. So the idea of being trapped, feeling imprisoned, slavery to the material, it's a very dark, dysphoric card. If we look at the Empress, we can see how it's really inspired by Greek mythology, and we can think of Demeter, who was the goddess of the harvest. We can think of the Holy Roman Empress, and so she represents fecundity, fertility, new beginnings, new birth. So if you're embarking on some sort of new enterprise and you draw this card, it can represent that it's a good omen to start something new. Another beautiful card, and it shows how thoughtful Waite was in designing his deck, is the Hermit, and it represents seeking, searching, light in the darkness. It represents the mystic. It represents the sort of solitary, individualistic side of the inner life, of the spiritual life. And so it represents, if you draw it, the inner quest, the personal quest, spending time with yourself, contemplating, reflecting. This card, the Emperor, it makes me think of Charlemagne, or the Holy Roman Emperor, and it's a very secure card, a very masculine card, represents control, represents order, represents stability, masculine order, economic and social power. If you look at the Lovers, they symbolize union, marriage, completion, idealism. They represent the divinity of man. So you can think of Adam and Eve. You can think of the Garden of Eden. If you look at the Tower, it represents disaster, catastrophe, divine judgment for being arrogant, for hubris. And it's a reference to the Tower of Babel and the idea of God smiting the human being for his arrogance in trying to rival him by building the tower. If you look at the Hierophant, so this is obviously a reference to the Pope. So if you draw this card, it could represent, your spiritual teacher. It could represent who your spiritual authority is. It can represent institutional religion, institutional power. So in that way, it could represent maybe a false teacher, a false religious authority. And then the name, the Hierophant, it's coming from the ancient Greek mysteries. And so the high priest, in the ancient Greek religion, we called him the Hierophant. If we look at this card, the High Priestess, it's basically a reference to the Oracle of Delphi, right? So we said before we had the Pope, we had the Oracle, and so instead of masculine spiritual authority, we have this card, and it represents feminine spiritual authority instead. If we look at this card, the Chariot, you can see it's derived more from Egyptian symbolism, and the Chariot represents balance, reconciling opposites, reconciling two opposing principles. If we look at the minor arcana and some of the symbols here, so here's one beautiful card, which is the Three of Wands, and so this represents new beginnings, discovery, adventure, openness to the future. This is another gorgeous card, the Six of Wands. So you can see that they use the laurel crown. And so if you think of triumph, victory, right, you would be rewarded with the laurel crown. If you look at this one, the Seven of Swords, you can see that's referencing Charon, the ferryman of the Greek underworld. So this card can represent a passage, it could represent a transition. This card, the Ten of Cups, right, is one of the really most beautiful cards, most positive cards. It symbolizes marriage, it represents union, it represents completion. If you take a look at the Three of Cups, you have another auspicious card. It represents good fortune, it represents success. If you look at it from a theological perspective, it could symbolize the three heavenly virtues, faith, hope, and love. If you look at this card, the Five of Wands, it can represent inner turmoil, conflict, an inner combat that you have to overcome. If you take a look at the Nine of Pentacles, it represents prosperity, it represents abundance, someone enjoying the fruit of the harvest. If you take a look at the Nine of Cups, you can see that the man is very secure, he's very content, he's very satisfied with his status and wealth. If you look at the Six of Pentacles, this seems like an alternate version of the Justice card, and it represents giving to each what is their due. Some receive charity, and that's right, and others don't. If we look at this card, the Six of Cups, if you think of masculine and feminine, of giving and receiving, giving a gift, passing things on, senior to junior, that appears to be a part of the symbolism of this card. If you look at this one, the Five of Pentacles, it represents impoverishment, it represents injury, it represents disability, being cast out of sanctuary, cast into homelessness. If you look at this card, the Nine of Swords, it represents despair, it represents aloneness. The swords are here a very hostile, negative symbol. If you look at this card, the Ten of Swords, it represents defeat, disaster, death. And this card is a very different image compared to some of the other cards that refer to defeat or death. And so this one, there doesn't seem to be any hope for redemption or for triumph in defeat, as opposed to some of the other images that we have. If you look at this card, the Nine of Wands, the wands appear to represent an obstacle. So if you draw this card, there's some sort of barrier, some sort of problem you have to overcome in order for you to achieve your objective or to achieve your goal. There are other cards as well. There are the virtue cards, so you have these ideas like strength and justice, and then you have other cards still like the concept cards, and so these have things like the Wheel of Fortune, and justice as well. Okay, so the purpose here was to give you a general overview, a general guide, and sort of introduce you to the tarot for the first time. And so I hope I've encouraged some of you to maybe appreciate this more and see how there is a beauty in sort of the symbolism and imagery of the cards, and how you could use it as a tool for self-knowledge.